So this is part 3 of Australia's poetry in the 20th century, and we're looking at the 20th century shift and how the insular world of colonial Australia is now about to be exposed to outside world pressure. In 1901, which is the year of Federation, Queen Victoria dies. She takes with her a lot of her conservative values, and with the dawning of a new king, we certainly start to see shifts in attitudes. More specifically, though, we're going to look at world events, the Great Depression, the wars, including the two Great Wars, the changing laws for Indigenous Australians, and the changing roles for women. The first poem I've got here, Humdinger, is a very moving poem, and I thoroughly recommend you pause now and read of the suffering. There are certainly very clear references to the Southern Cross that we would recall from the Eureka Stockade days. But how does the hero of the Eureka Stockade stand up against incredible poverty and starvation and the prospect of having to go to war? So the Great Depression really highlights for Australian poets the impact of the outside world on the inside world. The perils of the bush have been replaced by the urban environment, and that urban environment is fraught with unemployment, and unemployment isn't something that can be solved easily. There's no strength and determination that can necessarily find you employment where employment isn't to be had. So pause for a moment, read this and have a look at what people did to survive, and bear in mind that that's only an extract of that poem. You might be quite interested in the impact of the Depression on this idea of what dream of the lucky country might have been challenged by someone writing about the Great Depression. I've lumped the world wars here together, though that's a little unfair because there was a significant difference between the two wars. But I've tried to capture it with these posters. Of course, from the First World War, the Anzac tradition is born. If you want to see a reenactment that is incredibly moving and confronting, watch the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan, because even war veterans said it was quite true to life. Suffice it to say that young Australian soldiers were put into an impossible situation, and they were killed en masse because of a military error in the landing. However, what arises out of that particular conflict is incredible ingenuity, desire to survive, and incredible camaraderie amongst those who had landed at Gallipoli. And from that we get the Anzac tradition, and those ideals of mateship have come to underpin the Australian dream. So those ideas of equality are supported by this brand of mateship that is incredibly important to the Australian psyche. The poetry, however, doesn't reflect what that poster might have offered, this promise of adventure. I've only picked out 2 poems, but of course there are many. But from Australian poets, Kenneth Slessor's work and Judith Wright's poem certainly capture a different perspective of war. This particular poem, Beach Burial, is very complex and moving, almost, it's considered an elegy, and it doesn't necessarily celebrate those ideals of the Anzac, but really looks at the expression of loss and the power of death in a very beautiful environment. The Company of Lovers by Judith Wright is a really powerful poem as well. It begins with a paradox written after the Second World War, but certainly capturing some of the observations of Judith Wright during that time, this competing idea of meeting and parting. And she offers us an insight into the raw emotions and fears of death. And you might be interested in looking at that challenge of what was offered as a heroic ideal and this more emotional reality of war. I suggest you pause and read it now. The next one is the Indigenous experience. So we've got the Great Depression, the World Wars, but also the changing policies affecting Australia's Indigenous people. Certainly during the colonised period, the numbers were diminished by disease, as we heard from Kath Walker in an earlier part of the presentation. But Indigenous people continued to suffer. They weren't recognised, and it wasn't until 1967 that they were actually granted the vote. So they have no voice within the democracy until well into the 20th century. So when you look at those ideals and freedom and the Stockman on his own riding down the hill, and you find out that in actual fact that freedom was denied to the Indigenous population, you will see in the poetry a real challenge to those values. High levels of unemployment exist within Australia's Indigenous community, lower standards of living, shorter life expectation, as you can see in this particular poster, greater rates of contracting preventable disease, poor education, so many entrenched problems. And yet, within context, Australia's Indigenous population were expected to fight in the war. They are allowed to fight in the war for the country and national pride, but they weren't allowed to go to the pub and have a beer with those men they stood in the battlefields when they returned to Australia. So there's this real conflict. The lucky country, as Kath Walker or Oodgeroo of the Noonuccal tribe talks about in her video, but also this conflict within our culture of allowing them to have a voice and an identifiable part of the democracy. The other very important policy that had an enormous impact on Australia's Indigenous population was that of the Stolen Generation. So they called it the Aborigines Protection Act, where children were forcibly removed from their parents so that they could be assimilated. But their poetry is not really heard until the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. I'd recommend you read this poem. I find it quite a moving and beautiful poem. Vernon Archie actually lives in Brisbane, but he is from Innisfail. He's an Indigenous poet and artist. This particular poem is hanging in an international gallery. Many of his works hang both in national and international galleries of quite great esteem. And he does look at entrenched racism and ideas of protest and the experience of Australia's Indigenous population. Poetry that does reflect the Indigenous experience is quite interesting. I'll show you some from Mary Gilmore, after whom Gilmore House is named, but it's certainly towards the end of the latter period of the 20th century, and certainly with the work of Oodgeroo Noonuccal, starts to reflect the suffering endured by Australia's Indigenous people. And it's important to look at, too, within that community, the different voices that have been silenced. If you look at the final dot point on this slide, it's interesting how poetry and language itself can silence the voice of a community. Sometimes Indigenous poetry is criticised because the oral traditions and the oral traditions of the history and the songwriting in Indigenous language is not reflected in the poetry. So in order to be heard, Indigenous writers have to use the rhythms and metre that belong to Western writing. And only Western writing tends to be popularised because there is an expectation in poetry to follow particular ways of sounding and appearing and ideas being expressed through poetic devices. So if you're looking at doing an Indigenous writer, for example, I'll show you Kevin Gilbert's work in a moment, you might like to look at how Western styles of poetry writing are exploited by Indigenous writers to get into the psyche of the larger, wider cultural perspective. The Hunter of the Black, written by Mary Gilmore, so she's less likely to be considered entrenched in the 20th century, but she, I find, is a very brave woman. She's a woman, for a start, having a voice, and her voice, she gives a voice to some hideous experiences of local Indigenous tribes with which she became familiar and that she studied. The Hunter of the Black is a story about Indigenous people who were forced to track their own tribe members, who were killed by white men who actually kept, I guess, as a badge of honour, knots on a belt as a representation of the number of kills. So if you're looking at the Australian dream, you might look at how she challenges this ideal of freedom and equality and a fair go. You could even look at the ideas of mateship and how that's forcibly challenged. This second poem is about the Swans at Night, where early in the 20th century Mary Gilmore writes about the disappearing Indigenous population through the metaphor of swans, because she is a woman writing about something she probably would be at the time very unpopular. Stolen generation poetry is starting to emerge. We see less of it in the early works of the 20th century, but certainly in the latter part. This little clipping is taken from a paper, and above it is written what's underneath the picture. But it basically says, a group of tiny half-caste and quadroon children at the Darwin half-caste home. The Minister for the Interior, Mr Perkins, recently appealed to charitable organisations in Melbourne and Sydney to find homes for the children and rescuing them from becoming outcasts. I chose that particular image because if we're looking at a dream that is meant to be available to everyone, we might consider that Australia's Indigenous children and those who come from parents who are both Indigenous and Anglo-Celtic or Saxon certainly were not considered part of that dream. If you're unfamiliar with the Stolen Generation, this is a short clip about what it is about. Oops, sorry.
The removal of Aboriginal children from their families and traditional lives began in the late 1800s and continued until the late 1960s and 1970s. The children who were removed from their homes and families during this period became known as the Stolen Generation. The removal of children affected almost every Indigenous family at the time and has had a deep impact on Aboriginals to this very day. The denial of contact with family and friends meant that the children lost many years of love, affection, care and education about their Indigenous heritage. The family of the child also felt great sadness and loss because the child was no longer with them. Many of the Stolen Generation children grew up confused about their identity. This left many children unsure of their place in society.
You might like to watch the film Follow the Rabbit Proof Fence or read the book to look at that more closely.